For 14 centuries, the writing system of ancient Egypt was completely and totally silent, not because the information was not there carved into the stone, not because the monuments had crumbled or the papyri had burned or the inscriptions had been deliberately defaced by enemies seeking to erase what Egypt had recorded. The hieroglyphs were there. They had survived. They stared back at every civilization that encountered them across those 14 centuries. The Arabs who built their cities using stones taken from ancient temples, the medieval European scholars who visited Egypt and stood before inscribed walls and understood nothing, the Renaissance travelers who copied the symbols into notebooks they carried back across the Mediterranean to scholars who could not read them either and said nothing. The silence was not in the stone. It was in the loss of the key that unlocked what the stone was saying. The priests who knew how to read, hieroglyphs had died. The tradition that transmitted the knowledge from one generation to the next had broken, somewhere in the first centuries of the Common Era, as Egypt converted to Christianity, and the old religion with its old writing system was abandoned. And the break was so complete that the knowledge did not survive in any recoverable form. The writing system that had recorded the thoughts, the theology, the history, the medicine, the astronomy, the legal reasoning, and the daily administrative reality of one of the longest-lasting and most sophisticated civilizations in human history had become, by the medieval period, pure visual mystery. Beautiful, monumental, completely and absolutely opaque. The Rosetta Stone ended that silence. Found in 1799 by soldiers serving in Napoleon's Egyptian expedition near the town of Rashid, Rosetta in European usage, the stone is a priestly decree issued in 196 BCE, during the reign of the Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy V, inscribed in 3 different scripts, hieroglyphs at the top, Demotic script in the middle, and Greek at the bottom. The Greek was readable. Classical Greek scholarship was alive and active in European universities. The assumption was that all 3 versions of the text said the same thing in 3 different writing systems, which meant that the readable Greek text was a potential key to the unreadable Egyptian texts above it. What followed was 2 decades of competitive, obsessive, occasionally dishonest scholarly combat between Thomas Young, the English polymath, and physician who made crucial early breakthroughs in identifying the phonetic values of several hieroglyphic signs, and in recognizing that the oval cartouches in hieroglyphic texts enclosed royal names, and Jean-François Champollion, the French linguist who had been studying Coptic, the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, preserved in the Christian churches of Egypt since childhood, and who, in September 1822, achieved the full decipherment and communicated it in a letter to the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres in Paris, that is one of the most consequential documents in the history of human scholarship. Champollion fainted after writing it, collapsing from the physical and psychological exhaustion of a life's work finally arriving at its conclusion, the total expenditure of energy that comes when a person has been running towards something for decades and suddenly reaches it. His brother found him unconscious at his desk, and he did not recover consciousness for several days. The decipherment was celebrated at the time and has been celebrated in the centuries since as one of the supreme intellectual achievements of the modern era, and it genuinely was. But what the achievement meant in practice, what happened when scholars equipped with the tools Champollion had developed began actually reading the vast, largely untranslated body of hieroglyphic and hieratic text that Egypt contained in its papyri and its temple walls and its tomb inscriptions, is a story that has been unfolding for 2 full centuries since that September morning in 1822, and that continues to produce findings that overturn assumptions, challenge established historical narratives, and reveal an ancient civilization whose complexity, whose intellectual sophistication, whose practical understanding of the natural world, and whose engagement with the fundamental questions of human life was so far from what the outside world had imagined that each new translation has functioned less like confirmation of what was expected and more like a series of successive revelations of how wrong the expectations were. What researchers expected to find when they read hieroglyphs was myth. What they found was medicine. What they expected was religious dogma presented in the language of divine authority. What they found was surgical technique described in clinical language, pharmacological knowledge validated by modern chemistry, astronomical observation supported by mathematical calculation, legal reasoning sophisticated enough to anticipate concepts that European jurisprudence would not develop for another 2,000 years, and love poetry so immediate and so emotionally recognizable that scholars who spent their careers surrounded by the monumental grandeur of Egyptian civilization found themselves reading words that could have been written by someone alive today. The medical papyri represent the category of decoded hieroglyphic content where the gap between expectation and reality is widest, most consequential, and most demanding of explanation. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, purchased by the American Egyptologist and dealer Edwin Smith in Luxor in 1862, and now held in the collection of the New Yorker Academy of Medicine, is the oldest known surgical text in the entire recorded history of human civilization. It dates in its current form to approximately 1600 BCE, but is believed by most scholars who have studied its language and terminology to be a copy of a document considerably older than its transcription date. The archaic forms of certain technical terms and the grammatical structures of specific passages are consistent with an original composition during the Old Kingdom period, potentially as early as 2500 BCE, which would make the underlying knowledge it encodes roughly contemporary with the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. What this papyrus contains is not ritual. It is not prayer to healing gods. It is not invocation of supernatural powers to drive out the demons of disease. It is a systematic clinical examination of 48 trauma injuries, organized in a format so methodologically rigorous, so consistent in its approach, and so recognizable in its underlying logic that modern surgeons who have studied translations of the document describe the experience of reading it as one of surprising recognition rather than exotic distance. Each of the 48 cases in the Edwin Smith Papyrus follows precisely the same organizational format without exception. A title that identifies the injury type in clinical terms. A section of examination findings describing what the physician observes when they look at and palpate the injury. A diagnosis that names the condition based on the examination findings. An assessment of prognosis expressed through a 3-category system that translates most accurately as a condition I will treat, a condition I will contend with, and a condition not to be treated. And then either detailed. Treatment instructions for the cases deemed treatable, or an explicit statement of why treatment will not be attempted for the cases deemed fatal. The prognostic categorization, the explicit formal acknowledgement built into the structure of the document that some injuries are survivable with skilled intervention, some may be survivable with great effort and uncertain outcome, and some are fatal regardless of anything that medical skill can do, is a clinical framework that modern emergency medicine would recognize immediately as triage doctrine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains triage as a formalized medical concept 3,500 years before modern emergency medicine gave it a name and built protocols around it. The treatments described in the Edwin Smith Papyrus are not incantations. Case 6 describes a wound to the eyebrow that has penetrated to the bone, and its treatment involves closing the wound with adhesive strips of linen placed across the opening, conceptually identical to the butterfly strips and steri strips that modern emergency medicine uses for wound closure in injuries that do not require sutures. Case 1 describes a scalp wound reaching the skull and instructs the physician to suture it, place fresh meat over it on the first day of treatment, and then treat with grease, honey, and lint on subsequent days. Fresh meat is a wound. Dressing sounds primitive until modern researchers recognize several things. Simultaneously, fresh meat contains growth factors that promote wound healing. Honey has broad-spectrum antimicrobial properties derived from its low water activity and hydrogen peroxide content that modern wound care has returned to after antibiotic resistance made conventional antimicrobials less reliable, and the use of maggots, which colonize fresh meat, for wound debridement was a recognized medical practice that persisted into the 20th century because clinical observation consistently confirmed that it worked. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, and containing over 700 medical prescriptions and remedies, addressing conditions from intestinal disease to skin conditions to eye problems to dental pain, expanded the picture that the Edwin Smith Papyrus had opened in directions that generated significant academic discomfort throughout much of the 20th century. The discomfort arose because the Ebers Papyrus blends what looked to modern eyes like magical incantations with what looked to modern eyes like sophisticated pharmacological recipes, and the two categories appear side by side in the document without the sharp categorical distinction that modern medicine draws between scientific intervention and ritual practice. The academic response for much of the early and mid-20th century was to treat the magical elements as the primary content, as evidence that Egyptian healing was fundamentally supernatural in its orientation, and that the empirical elements were present, but essentially accidental. What subsequent chemical and botanical analysis of the substances described in the Ebers Papyrus demonstrated was that the pharmacological elements are not accidental discoveries embedded in a magical framework. They are the accumulated product of systematic empirical observation of biological effects across centuries of clinical practice. The Ebers Papyrus prescribes the use of willow bark preparations to reduce fever and inflammation. Willow bark contains salicin, which the human body metabolizes into salicylic acid, the active compound from which the acetyl salicylic acid we call aspirin is chemically derived. The ancient Egyptians had no knowledge of salicin, no concept of active chemical compounds, no framework for understanding why willow bark reduced fever. What they had was repeated clinical observation that it did reduce fever, recorded carefully enough that the observation persisted in their medical literature and was transmitted as practical knowledge to subsequent generations of physicians. The Ebers. Papyrus prescribes honey in wound treatment, honey whose antimicrobial properties modern wound care specialists now deploy against antibiotic-resistant infections. Because those properties operate through physical chemistry rather than through biological mechanisms that bacterial resistance can evolve around. It prescribes garlic, which contains allicin, a compound with demonstrated antimicrobial activity. It prescribes pomegranate preparations for intestinal parasites. Pomegranate contains alkaloids with genuine antiparasitic biological activity. The pattern of correspondence between what the Ebers papyrus prescribes and what modern pharmacology confirms as biologically active is not coincidence and cannot be explained as lucky guessing. It is the signature of a medical tradition based on sustained empirical observation over centuries, recording what worked without understanding why it worked, and transmitting that practical knowledge in a written form precise enough to survive. The astronomical knowledge encoded in hieroglyphic texts produced another layer of unexpected findings when the decipherment made those texts readable. The standard narrative of ancient Egyptian astronomy had placed it in the category of mythologized sky observation. A tradition that named star groupings after deities tracked the movements of celestial bodies primarily for religious and calendrical purposes, and produced the agricultural calendar based on the heliacal rising of Sirius that was the foundation of Egyptian timekeeping. This narrative was not false, but it was dramatically incomplete. The astronomical texts from multiple sites, read in conjunction with the architectural alignments that those texts helped explain, showed a tradition that was simultaneously mythological in its language and computational in its underlying methodology, that was not simply watching the sky and naming what it saw, but calculating, predicting, and applying astronomical knowledge to architectural and engineering problems with a precision that required systematic long-term observation organized and recorded with a consistency that went far beyond what the mythological narrative had implied. The Dendera zodiac, a circular astronomical ceiling decoration from a temple at Dendera dating to the Ptolemaic period, caused immediate scholarly controversy when it was removed from Egypt in 1821 and brought to France. It depicts the positions of recognizable celestial bodies, the planets, the moon, the sun, and specific star. Groupings, in a configuration that, when scholars calculated backward using the orbital mechanics of the solar system, corresponds to a specific and determinable astronomical date. The specificity of the configuration encoded in the Dendera zodiac implies a level of astronomical record-keeping and calculation that extends well beyond observational astronomy as previously understood. Recording a specific planetary configuration requires not just looking at the sky on a given night, but tracking and calculating the movements of multiple bodies over extended periods with enough precision to distinguish that configuration from others, and doing so consistently enough across generations of observation that the knowledge could be accurately preserved and depicted in architectural decoration. The diagonal calendars, sets of star transit tables inscribed in coffin lids and tomb ceilings from the Middle Kingdom period, represent another dimension of decoded astronomical knowledge that researchers had not fully anticipated. These tables, organized by decade periods across the year, allow the time of night to be determined by observing which specific star is transiting the meridian at any given moment. The system requires not just identifying stars, but cataloging their transit times with sufficient precision to produce a functional timekeeping system usable by the priests managing the timing of temple rituals and tomb construction activities. The organizational effort implied by these tables, sustained, systematic, multi-generational observation of stellar transits organized into searchable reference tables, reflects an astronomical institution of considerable sophistication. The legal and administrative texts decoded from hieroglyphic and hieratic sources revealed an ancient society with social arrangements that challenged assumptions so fundamental that the findings were initially resisted and remain incompletely integrated into popular understanding of ancient Egypt. Women in ancient Egypt possessed legal standing that their counterparts in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the medieval and early modern European civilization that considered itself more sophisticated in virtually every cultural and intellectual domain did not approach for another 2,000 years. Hieroglyphic and hieratic legal records from multiple dynastic periods, wills, property contracts, court records, marriage agreements, document Egyptian women owning property in their own names, independently of any male relative or husband, initiating and defending legal proceedings before official courts, entering binding contracts, inheriting estates, and bequeathing them to heirs of their own choosing, engaging in commercial transactions, and participating in the economic life of their communities as fully independent legal persons, rather than as dependents or wards whose legal standing derived from male guardians. This was not the exception in Egypt. It was the documented legal norm recorded across centuries of administrative records. The Deir el-Medina archives represent one of the richest collections of everyday administrative documents from the ancient world, and what they revealed about the daily experience of working Egyptians, the craftsmen and their families who lived in the purpose-built village adjacent to the Valley of the Kings and spent their working lives constructing and decorating the royal tombs, overturned in detail after detail the image of ancient Egypt as a civilization of absolute divine monarchy in which individual Egyptians were instruments of royal will rather than people with recognizable agency, grievances, and responses to those grievances. The records from Deir el-Medina include documents that most scholars identify as the earliest recorded labor strikes in human history. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, the workers responsible for cutting and decorating royal tombs stopped work entirely and staged what the administrative records describe in explicit terms as a sit-down protest outside the administrative compound, motivated by the repeated failure of the state to deliver their promised rations of grain, fish, vegetables, and other foodstuffs. The records document the workers articulating their grievances in direct language, the negotiations that followed between the workers and local administrative officials, and the partial resolution of the dispute through emergency delivery of some portion of the owed supplies. Workers withholding their labor because they had not been paid the wages they were owed, articulating that grievance collectively and publicly, negotiating with institutional authority, and achieving partial concessions through organized collective action, all of this recorded in administrative documents from 1170 BCE, is not the civilization of passive, God-fearing laborers that the monumental record of pyramids and temple complexes had suggested to the outside world. The decoded hieroglyphs of Deir el-Medina show a community with recognizable labor relations, recognizable disputes about compensation and working conditions, and recognizable collective responses to institutional failure that look far more like the labor history of the modern industrial world than like the absolute submission to divine authority that pharaonic monuments project. The love poetry decoded from hieroglyphic papyri produced what may have been the most immediately humanizing of all the unexpected findings. The collection of lyric poems preserved in the Chester Beatty papyrus and several related documents contains verse of romantic longing, sexual attraction, praise of physical beauty, and the specific emotional vulnerability of people in the condition of being in love that has no relationship to the conventional image of ancient Egyptian literary culture as theological and funerary in its orientation. A young man describes his heart accelerating when he catches sight of a woman across a garden. A woman describes the physical beauty of the man she loves with directness and sensual specificity. Lovers separated by circumstances use the imagery of the Nile and its birds and plants to express the ache of absence. The emotion is recognizable. The experience is familiar. The specific imagery of papyrus, marshes, and lotus blossoms and Nile floods is particular to its place in time, but the emotional content, this is what it feels like to love someone and miss them and want them and be embarrassed by the intensity of what you feel, is universal. That the civilization which built the pyramids and developed the mummification techniques that preserved human tissue across millennia and carved the hieroglyphs into stone walls that still stand after 4,000 years also produced this poetry, also experienced and recorded love with this freshness and this specificity and this emotional honesty, is the finding that reframes everything else. It means the ancient Egyptians are not a distant, alien, incomprehensible other whose civilization can be appreciated aesthetically while remaining fundamentally foreign in human terms. The decoded hieroglyphs demonstrate that they were people whose intellectual achievements were extraordinary, whose medical and astronomical and mathematical knowledge was far more sophisticated than the outside world had, understood whose social arrangements were in some respects more advanced than those of civilizations that came after them, and that history has treated as representing progress beyond Egypt, and who, through all of that, remained people experiencing the ordinary human things with the same intensity that human beings have always experienced them. They looked at the sky and developed mathematical frameworks to describe what they saw. They treated injured and sick patients with interventions whose biological mechanisms they did not understand and whose clinical effectiveness they recorded with systematic precision. They built legal systems in which individual people had rights that courts were obligated to recognize. They wrote poetry about being in love. They went on strike when they were not paid. They wrote instructions for the dead to carry with them into whatever came next, including in those instructions an ethical accounting of the harm they had and had not done to other people during their lives. The hieroglyphs were decoded. 200 years of reading what they said has produced a picture of ancient Egyptian civilization that the monuments alone, standing silent in the desert, could never have communicated. A picture not of alien grandeur, but of human complexity, human knowledge, human aspiration, and human feeling expressed across thousands of years in a writing system that was lost for 14 centuries and then recovered, letter by letter, sign by sign, through the obsessive scholarly labor of people who believed that what the stone was saying was worth the lifetime it would take to learn to hear it. They were right. What the stone was saying was worth it. It turns out Egypt was not saying what anyone expected. It was saying something true.